everybody, and welcome to my February reading wrap-up. We're also going to talk about what I'm hoping to accomplish in March. Perhaps a bit ambitious considering it's getting up to final project season, but I'm hoping to read something outside of my coursework, but we'll see. February was definitely very coursework heavy, so I'm just going to go in like chronological order from what I read. So let's just jump right in. So the first thing that I finished in February, and actually I don't remember if I finished this at the very start of February or the very end of January, but I'm just gonna include it. I read The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. So this was the first George Eliot book that I've read other than Adam Bede, which was a long time ago, and I did not like Adam Bede at the time because I think that like my perception of it was a bit tainted by the fact that I really did not like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and we just read Tess before Adam Bede, and Adam Bede is like a very, very similar kind of story. But as we've also been reading more George Eliot for this seminar that I'm taking that is on George Eliot, I'm starting to I think George Eliot just isn't the author for me from this period. I don't mind the books while I'm reading them, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of into this, I'm not minding it. But then I finish it and I just go, actually, I hated that. I didn't hate The Mill on the Floss. I enjoyed the book. I think that so far it's been my favorite thing that we've finished. To be fair, we've only read The Mill on the Floss, Felix Holt, and then we've started Silas Marner. And so I definitely prefer The Mill on the Floss to Adam Bede. And this book is also a bit interesting because it's sort of arguably probably one of George Eliot's most autobiographical. So we follow Maggie and Tom Tulliver from their sort of early childhood through into adolescence and early adulthood. And Maggie is this really precocious, kind of wild child kid who is really smart. She loves philosophy books and she loves reading. And she eventually gets into kind of religious philosophy. So we kind of see the potential that she'd had if she'd been allowed to pursue those things or receive the education that is afforded to her brother Tom, who was much more of the street smarts kind of kid. And so we see them in childhood. Tom is getting this education. He's getting kind of the education of a gentleman. Because his father wants him to have the skills to take over the mill and to kind of get the lawyers off their backs because they are in some kind of economic trouble. But then once they get into adulthood and this is all kind of coming to a head, we see that that education really is not preparing Tom for what he needs. And Maggie likewise is really just kind of stuck. And then Maggie is really desperate for love and affection and approval from her family and especially from Tom. So we see how that's kind of impacting her, and she has these two romantic relationships and neither of them are really a particularly good fit. She is friends when she's a kid with this boy Philip, but as they get older there's not really any kind of attraction there, and also he's the son of the lawyer who Maggie and Tom's father sees as having kind of destroyed him. So there's a lot of family clashing there, and also Maggie's this just isn't quite right. And then later she kind of has this dalliance with Stephen, who's actually engaged to her cousin, and the two are really attracted to each other, but there's not much else there, and also obviously it's gonna cause a lot of family problems. So yeah, she has these kind of options, and then but they're not really options for her, and she doesn't actually pursue them, but they still kind of damage her life and her relationship with Tom. So in that sense, I did find this book really interesting. I will say kind of in the adult sections my interest was steadily kind of waning. My thing with George Eliot is that she kind of draws every scene on just a little bit too long. For example, I really like her sense of humor, but she just kind of plays a joke out until it's done for. So I'm actually really curious because we haven't talked about it a ton in class, what her kind of publishing practices and publishing relationship was, because it definitely feels like she had maybe a lot of control. I believe we were talking about it in relation to Adam Bede, because in Adam Bede, there's this chapter that just like completely breaks the narrative and is essentially an author's note. Like she just kind of interjects herself into the narrative and is like, here's a bunch of other things you should know, and also just some other things that I want to ruminate on. And I believe that this is the chapter that an editor was like, or publisher was like, you should cut this. And she said, how about no? So it does seem like she had a reasonable amount of control potentially. So I am curious to know if that is like the case with something like Mill on the Floss. It's also like George Eliot also had an older brother that seemed to have had kind of like a similarly sort of contentious relationship with, but the two like were close, but at one point after like one of George Eliot's marriages, he'd like stopped speaking to her for a time and then eventually came back into her life. And obviously we have this very like smart girl with a lot of potential that is really stifled by sort of social circumstances. So presumably very potentially accurate to George Eliot's childhood, possibly. So yeah, I did like this one, but wasn't my absolute favorite book that we read. I find it really hard to rate these kind of books because like I can appreciate it as sort of like of its historical moment, and I can appreciate it like for what it's doing, but did I love it? I don't know. I always find it hard to rate things that we read in class because obviously we spend so much seminar time talking about it that I kind of like talk myself into liking it more or less than I sort of originally did, especially as you start to like really unpack the text more and you're like appreciating all the things that it's doing. It makes you go like, well, it's doing all these things, but did I enjoy it? So how do I rate it? Do I rate it on vibes or do I rate it on these other things? So I'm gonna give it a 3. Then the next book that I finished was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I have not read this before. The only Woolf novel that I read prior to taking my Woolf seminar this year was Jacob's Room. And so it is interesting to read Mrs. Dalloway with that book in mind because it is doing the similar sort of like stream of consciousness thing. It also is following, it's almost doing like the opposite of what Jacob's Room does, because in Jacob's Room, we switch narrators, but we're switching narrators all kind of about Jacob. So we're seeing Jacob's life through the impressions of other people. Whereas Mrs. Dalloway, like we're switching narrators and getting very sort of deep into the interiority of them themselves. So while we are seeing like how other people are kind of like perceiving them or making assumptions about them, it is also like really rooted in like who are those characters as they are. And then the narration will kind of like flip really smoothly, and sometimes you don't know exactly like when it's the narrator talking, when it's the character whose POV you're in. The modernist and stream of consciousness is another kind of hard one for me because I do really appreciate it kind of aesthetically, but it's not necessarily my absolute favorite thing to read. But I did actually wind up enjoying Mrs. Dalloway more than I had maybe anticipated. We'd also read this not long after reading Dr. Stacey Patton's essay, or I don't know if you'd call it an essay, it's like a Substack article on Woolf, and she has these kind of like flippant, very incendiary comments about all of Woolf's work. And the one that she says about Mrs. Dalloway is that like, you know, it's this book about this like woman who has no problems that's like wandering around London, which obviously is like, I think it's being a bit facetious, and it's like a funny summary. So we were thinking about it kind of through that lens and like, how do we feel about those kind of comments about it? Obviously, Mrs. Dalloway is doing a lot more. It's doing a lot more about class and kind of the warriors. Like she is writing about the lost generation and all of these people who've been like really impacted by the war. So yeah, I enjoyed this one and I would recommend it. I feel like you definitely have to know kind of what it's about going in. I think that it makes it like a bit easier to read. And it's also what kind of kicked off our section on like Woolf adaptations. So that's been really interesting to see like how people keep coming back to that. And it does seem to be sort of the Woolf work that people hold on to the most or adapt the most, which is interesting. I also read a couple short stories that I want to mention for my TA class, and one that I'd read before is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. And then we also read The Ones Who Stay and Fight by N.K. Jemisin, I believe is how you say her last name, which is kind of a short story like written in response to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And this is something that gets put on a lot of, I think, like first and second year university syllabuses. Sometimes I think even like in high school people will read it. It's kind of an interesting example like for dystopian literature and utopian literature. And I really enjoyed reading those in conjunction with one another. This was for my TA class. And so we were talking about like, okay, what is the conflicting messages of these two? Is one better than the other? Like, is Jemison saying that this world that she's imagining is better than the one in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, or is she doing something similar? Like, what is kind of the goal here? So yeah, I really enjoyed both of those, and I think you can definitely find The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas online, and I believe you can find The Ones Who Stay and Fight as well. I'm pretty sure we read it with like a link to a web page, so I would recommend both of those because they're really interesting. And also like an interesting kind of like dipping your toe into Le Guin, who is obviously like a really huge fantasy author. And then this is when I did a couple of Kristen Ashley binges. So I reread Tenderfoot, which is one of the Avenging Angels novels, and that one is probably my favorite in the series so far. I'm kind of in two minds about this series. Like, sometimes I really enjoy it, and then some things just really don't work for me because it kind of has this like Charlie's Angels setup, and the girls are all kind of like vigilantes, which worked for the first two books because the crimes were really connected to our like female leads like backstory. Like for the first book, she was dealing with things with like her sister from her childhood, and in the second book, they're searching for the main lead's brother. But then in this book is where the kind of like Avenging Angels, Charlie's Angels plots is like deviating from more of like the romance or the like primary character development. So yeah, in this one I enjoyed it because more of the focus was on the two characters and their backstories, which makes a lot of sense because Hobby was really going through it. So I feel like it definitely warranted doing more of like a character focused thing than really weaving in the kind of like vigilante crime fighting shtick. And I just really enjoy this dynamic in Kristen Ashley books because like Hobby is very hardcore and intense, and then Harlow is just like a ball of sunshine. So I do enjoy that dynamic when it plays out in Kristen Ashley. I like it a lot more than in the previous novel. We had the girl who kept saying how she was so edgy, and I'm like, edgy people don't tell you that they're edgy. But after that I read Bad Medicine, which the first like 20-30% I was not enjoying it. And this one was one that I was looking forward to because our main like male lead is the cousin of one of the characters from the Rock Chick series. And in that Rock Chick book, we have like one of my favorite male heroes in that series. Like, I really like Luke Stark, but I hate Ava in that book. Like, I struggle to reread it because Ava is so annoying, and it's like mainly in her POV, and she talks to herself. Like, she has good Ava and bad Ava. She's got the angel and the devil on her shoulders. And then also she's just really on one. And she like has really low self-esteem because it's one of those stories where she was like a bit bigger as a kid and then she lost weight, and now suddenly she's got literally like 4 men over the course of this book that are just deeply obsessed with her, and I find that irritating. I feel like parts of that story were handled well, of this kind of like new her that she's got, but other parts were kind of like, this does feel very early 2000s. But I do really like Luke in that book, so I was looking forward to this, especially because like the sort of guise of this book is having like, it's supposed to be like the Rock Chick series but updated, but Gabriel sounded like a Red Pill podcaster at the start of this book. So Willow is, in the previous book, she had this ex-boyfriend who was kind of involved in one of the crimes because he was just like, you know, general dirtbag. And so she also, you know, had a dad who wasn't great, like string of kind of bad boyfriends in her past, so she's decided to swear off all men, which I think Ava did in Rock Chick Revenge as well. And also Willow talks to 2 people in her head. She's got like Logic and then the Dreamer. Gabriel gets up on his soapbox and kind of does a not all men speech, which is not great, but in the context of what Willow is doing, like, it makes a bit of sense because you're like, Willow, come on now. But he also talks about, like, you know, I want a woman, like, I love a challenge. Like, I love a challenge. That's why I like you, because this is like a challenge, which I feel like that wouldn't sweep me off my feet if a guy told me that. And so he's like, I never back down from a challenge. That's what I want in my life. You know, like, I don't want a girl who wants to, like, stay home with the kids. Okay. Willow's a baker and a waitress, which respectable, but he's literally found, like, the most family-oriented person. Like, he has this line about not wanting a woman whose entire life is her family. Buddy, that's Willow. It's just, eventually that kind of stops. Like, they stop philosophizing, so then you can actually sort of get more into the story without wanting to beat up the characters. However, at the end of the book, we're like, this is gonna be our lives, so exciting. Willow works like a 9-to-5 baking, and they occasionally go out and try new food. And they're planning on having 2.5 kids and probably a golden retriever. Gabriel, very unconventional job, sure. Willow is doing this Charlie's Angels thing. That's kind of crazy. But, like, they're living very conventional lives. And so I didn't enjoy that perspective, for one thing, because it was annoying, and for another, because it's just, like, very inaccurate to what the characters were doing. But once we hit, like, the 20-30% mark, they toned that down a bit and you could just appreciate the characters a bit more. However, I still feel like I needed more development from their backstory. Like, the fact that this really awful thing happened to Willow in the previous book really was not a huge part of the plot, and I expected it to be more of a thing. So that one definitely wasn't my favorite, but I'm not gonna, like, stop reading the series because I have enjoyed the other books so far. I wouldn't say they've, you know, replaced some of my Kristen Ashley favorites, but I do like the series. I wish that they'd either toned down the Charlie's Angels thing or made it a bit more, like, silly and ridiculous. Like, I wish that it kind of leaned more into the comedy of it, because it is kind of a crazy, sort of stupid thing for these women to be doing. So I wish that that was, like, played up a bit more, and I think that I would appreciate it a bit more that way. But I am enjoying it, and actually the next book is going to be Nox and Luna, who I've been super excited for since we kind of got them introduced in the second book. So I'm really holding out for them. I feel like they kind of got introduced in the second book, definitely in the third, and we've been getting teasers of them in this one. So I am really excited for their book because I think it's gonna be good. This one was just like a bit of a miss for me. And then after that, we're back into sort of the Virginia Woolf of it all. So we read The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which is what the movie is based on. And again, I really enjoyed this. I went into it kind of blind, which I do recommend. So this book is following, like, 3 women. So we have our kind of most direct Mrs. Dalloway adapted section. So we have Clarissa, who is living in, like, late 90s New York. And she has been with her partner, Sally, for, like, almost 20 years. She has a daughter, and she is basically she's setting up this party to celebrate the work of one of her lifelong best friends, Richard, who is dying of AIDS. That relationship was far and away, like, my favorite part of the book. It had all the lines that, like, got me choked up, and I just really enjoyed that story. We talked a bit about how this was representing, you know, like, the work that lesbian and sapphic women did during the AIDS crisis to, like, care for gay men during that time. So, like, seeing that kind of historical relationship represented there was really nice. And I just loved the two of them. And I think that it really represented the kind of, like, complicated relationship that they had, like, where it's a bit platonic, but also in a way kind of romantic, even though their relationship has started that way and hadn't been for many, many years, but still having a little bit of that. And it was complicated, but it, like, doesn't detract from kind of, like, the love and the sort of steadfastness of their friendship. And I just really enjoyed those sections. And then we also have Laura Brown, who is a housewife in sort of post-war London, I believe. and she has a young son. She's planning like a family birthday party for her husband, and she's also like just really desperate to finish reading this wolf novel that she wants to get done because she's really sort of struggling with domestic life and finding happiness within it. And then our third narrator is Virginia Woolf herself, so it's following a day as she's writing Mrs. Dalloway and is, you know, receiving a visit from her sister. By this point, she has attempted suicide before, I believe, so her sister and Leonard, her husband, are all kind of watching her quite closely. And yeah, she's writing Dalloway, thinking about death a lot. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think that it is adapting Woolf and adapting Woolf's kind of aesthetic style without being like too on the nose or feeling too much like this kind of pet project. And also in the acknowledgements of the book, Michael Cunningham talks a lot about like reading the journals and the diaries, and he actually cites a lot of Woolf's journals and diaries, so you can kind of see like how he is using those sources to write the hours, which is really interesting. I haven't watched the movie yet, but I do want to. Apparently they toned down, especially in Virginia Woolf sections, there's this really interesting thing that Cunningham does where there's kind of like hints of incest, basically, in the way that he depicts her relationship with her sister. They like kiss each other on the lips, and she says that she leans in and her sister did too. And so it's not something that like is addressed super explicitly, but like it's definitely there. And I think that that was like such an interesting choice because I wasn't like the most familiar with the diaries, so I'd asked this in class if like that's something that comes up much, and people said that it's not. So I think that that was a really interesting angle because we do know that Virginia was, you know, she really admired her mother and her sister, who were these kind of like angel in the house characters in a way, or types. And so I think having it come out in that way in the hours in a literary sense definitely really worked. I think that there are probably, and we discussed this a bit in seminar, like kind of ethical questions about like what do you do when you're, or how do you take it when you're writing like a real person in that way. Also, just to mention, like the prologue of this novel is sort of like a written fictionalization. I don't know, like a written, he writes out the scene of Virginia Woolf committing suicide. So we also talked a lot about kind of the ethics of that and like where does this fall like with sort of like a fictionalized biographical sort of work, which I don't necessarily have super strong feelings on. But I think that they're interesting and important questions to like ruminate on. So I really enjoyed the hours a lot. It's one of my favorite books that we've read in that course so far, for sure. And then back into George Eliot, Felix Holt the Radical. I don't know how to feel about this one because I was really enjoying it, and then volume 3, the last like third of the novel, oh my god, please wrap it up. This book just felt like, even though there's a lot of things going on, it felt like there wasn't enough plot or substance or whatever for it to be as long as it was. It was definitely very drawn out. But I do think that this was really sort of raising interesting political questions. It is about ostensibly is kind of like about one of the reform bills, which is essentially about like voting rights and who can vote. And the book is taking place around this election. So we have like the Whigs, the Radicals, and then the Tories, I believe. And they're all kind of, but then the radical candidate is also obviously part of this like landowner class, upper class. And then we have Felix, who is like very working class and what wants to and sort of works to remain working class, and he is like a political philosopher, radical basically. So we see his radicalism contrasted with the kind of more like former politicized radicalism in interesting ways. Felix Holt is maybe a little bit wooden, not as bad as Adam Bede, but then that is also interesting because you're like, okay, he is the one who is actually most invested in sort of the lives and the position of working class people, but he's so bad at communicating it and like getting people on his side. Every time he really tries to address people or address things, everything kind of goes wrong. So seeing like how is politics the way to move things forward. I think that the book does have this kind of interesting interrogation about the role of politics, and we read an article about is Felix Holt an anti-political novel, and so we were kind of debating that in class, and I think it is. Like, obviously it's very much about politics and is rooted in politics, but I think that it definitely is sort of saying that politics is not the way, or is not the first frontier for actual social and cultural change, because most politicians are really out for their own gain. So I think that it is a bit pessimistic about politics, but I don't think that it's pessimistic in general, which is an interesting balance. And we also see some of this coming out through like a marriage plot with Esther, who is very attracted to Felix, but in their first meeting, Felix kind of scolds her because he's like, you're silly, you're applying, you have all of this potential, like you're smart, you can be doing all of these things, but you're applying it to like silliness and being vapid and like material goods. And she's like, who are you? You're rude and annoying. But she's thinking about, she's like, he's also kind of right. And also she's attracted to him, so she does really like him. But then there's like a whole inheritance plot that's kind of hard to explain, but she can basically choose between marrying the guy who is like the radical political candidate and having this more like comfortable life with lots of money, or this life with Felix, and that is supposed to be this kind of like moral, intellectual life. I did find the marriage plot the most interesting, mainly because I kind of found Esther to be the most interesting character, and I did enjoy seeing those dynamics like playing out, and also how they're using that to represent sort of every person's involvement in politics, and also this representation of kind of women's positions here and how reliant they are on the men around them, just like caring about their lives and their opinions. Again, I enjoyed that one, but I do feel like it was dragged on a bit long or got a bit confusing. I don't know, it's just the actual writing style that sometimes doesn't do it for me. And then lastly, we read Three Parties by Ziad Sadi, I believe is how you say his name. So this is a pretty new book. I think it came out last year. It came out really recently, and this was really contentious in our Wolf class. So this book is about, it's set actually during the Obama administration, so it's kind of right after gay marriage became legal in the States. But it's by a Canadian author, actually. And it's a book about a Palestinian refugee who is planning this dinner party to come out to his family. And I think it was quite contentious because like a lot of people just didn't like the book. And I think that in our discussions, we eventually, I think mostly came to the consensus that like the book had all of these ideas that would have been really interesting, but it was just like the writing itself wasn't quite there, and I do agree with that. I think that I enjoyed it more than a lot of people in the class. I wasn't like blown away by it, but I did like it, and I do get what people were saying, and I would agree that the writing is maybe a bit amateurish is such like a heated word, but I do feel like it doesn't read super, some people are saying it kind of read like a YA novel, which I didn't like at first pick up on, but I wouldn't say that it doesn't. And the thing that I enjoyed about it is I think that it kind of goes against what you expect going in, because I think that you would expect Ferris to be a lot more likable than he is, basically. Like, Ferris sucks throughout the book, and every time he has the opportunity to suck a little bit less or to really show some character growth, he doesn't. And I think that that was a more interesting choice, to have this character that you really like rub up against. And I think one of the other things we were talking a bit about was this as an adaptation and how Mrs. Dalloway and sort of Wolfian is this. And there is sort of the framing of Mrs. Dalloway, like it opens with him buying flowers. There's this scene with a car, he's wondering who's inside. There is a suicide towards the end of the novel. And yeah, so it has the kind of like plot touch points of Mrs. Dalloway, but one of the major differences is that we don't get anyone's POV or narration other than Ferris. So we're like really rooted in him, and it can I think, start to feel like a bit claustrophobic because he's so like regimented. And I enjoyed the effect of that, I think, more than maybe some other people did. I will say, like, I think that the book could have been better. Like, I don't think the writing was incredible, but I enjoyed the attempt, I guess. And one thing, like, that we were talking about with Dalloway is we're like, okay, how much is Mrs. Dalloway, like, its themes, like, thinking about it as a war novel and about, like, the trauma of war and the aftermath of displacement and mental health and sort of like queer identity and coming out, and how much is Mrs. Dalloway just like Woolf's aesthetic style, because I don't think the book really makes much of an effort to replicate or really integrate her aesthetic style, and I can see that being disappointing if you're expecting it going in. I think some of us were getting like a little bit cynical about the fact that Saudi has a marketing degree, so it was a lot of like, well, it's using Mrs. Dalloway to like give this book a niche or to sell novels. And I do think that that is probably true. And I think that it is really important to have kind of Mrs. Dalloway connected to this novel as a way to like invite in an audience that is interested in sort of like literary works and classics, which are, by and large about and by white authors, and about sort of the experiences of people within like the Western world and the Western canon and everything. So I think that having the sort of Mrs. Dalloway connection is inviting in more or different readers than would maybe have picked up this book otherwise. But I also think that it's really important to read this book in connection with Mrs. Dalloway, and like, what is the significance of writing a book about a Palestinian refugee and connecting it to that literary history, like saying this is part of Mrs. Dalloway and the kind of Woolfian legacy, and also pointing out and drawing connections between that post-war experience and the experience of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees in North America. So yeah, I would kind of agree that this book was like a bit challenging to fully like parse your feelings about it, because I do really enjoy what it's trying to do, and I also enjoyed parts of the writing and of the narrative style. Like, I love an unreliable or a like dislikable narrator, but then I think that sometimes the writing maybe wasn't strong enough to support all of the ideas. So yeah, that is everything that I read in March. That's 9 things minus 2 short stories, so like 7. But we can say 9 if we're being generous. So yeah, the things that we're reading for the rest of my seminar classes, we're currently reading Silas Marner. I'm probably gonna finish that today, maybe, hopefully. And that is actually the George Eliot novel that I'm enjoying the most. And it's not just because it's like maybe a third of the other books, maybe even like a fourth. But it's also just been the most fun so far. It is still doing all of those things, like sort of thinking about class and sort of like the changing pace of life, because like George Eliot is writing from a time like deep into the Industrial Revolution. And I believe Silas Marner is taking place like a bit earlier, but they're in this like isolated town. So it's thinking about like, okay, this is why they're living like this, because they're more isolated from these more like tangible sort of effects of progress. And then it's also doing things, with class and religion, but it kind of has this kind of fairy tale feel. It's very A Christmas Carol. So I have been really, really enjoying that book so far. And yeah, I think it's gonna be my favorite George Eliot this term. And then we're also reading Daniel Deronda, which I don't know much about, but it is a tome, so we'll see. And then for Wolf, we're reading Orlando, which I haven't read before, and I'm really excited to get into. It's the book, Tilda Swinton is in the movie version, and it's a book about, I believe he is a noble man, and then one day he wakes up and his body is transformed into that of a woman, and it's kind of like their experiences through that. So I'm really excited to read that. And we're also reading Theories and Practice, which is another contemporary Woolf adaptation. I hate the title because I feel like I haven't started it yet, but I'm really excited to read the book. But the title, and maybe it's just because I'm reading it in the context of seeing it on a university syllabus, like I thought it was gonna be sort of like a critical reading. I thought it was gonna be like a nonfiction work, but it's not, it's a novel. And I feel like it's just not a great title for a novel, but I am really excited for the book. And then I'm also hoping to read Blood on Her Tongue by Johanna Van Veen, which is like this gothic, like vampiric novel that I'm super excited for. And then realistically, will I have time to read another fantasy novel? Probably not. So that's kind of top of my radar. And then I also have another Kristen Ashley arc that I need to read actually, that I'd started but haven't finished. It's called Perfect in Every Way. It's kind of this like mystery plot, which I really enjoy. I like when she kind of like dips her toe into other genres, and it's very kind of atmospheric and creepy, but still has her, you know, same flair. So I'm also hoping to finish that. But yeah, that is everything that I read in February, and hopefully we'll get a lot finished in March as well. So thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one.